Okay. Good morning. Welcome to our Board of County Commissioners meeting. Glad you're here, and as we always do, we start with a prayer, reading, or thought, and the Pledge of Allegiance, and we look to the audience for participation in that. If you'd like to volunteer to do so, are there any volunteers for a prayer, reading, or thought, and to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? You just raise your hand. I got 3 hands up. Which one? Cody? Pledge? Prayer? All right, thank you. Come on up. Yeah, we better have your name.
Bert Garfield, County Assessors. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for all many blessings. We thank you for this opportunity to gather together to discuss the concerns and issues that face our county. Ask special blessing upon our meeting, that we can be productive and professional, and that we can hear each other's points of view. We thank you for the blessings that we've received in our lives. Thank you for being in this country where we can exercise our rights to speak up and debate the things that we find important, that we can be an active participant in the government. We ask a special blessing upon the county commissioners, that they can use good judgment, and please bless the county employees too, that they may feel rewarded and appreciated for the work they do. When we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you for participating in that. This still sounds like it's soft on the microphones. I don't know if it needs to be turned up at all. You can hear all right? Okay. We will now build our agenda. We will put all items, consent agenda items and regular agenda items. We will consider them for the building part of our agenda on consent. And then we will go through the process of pulling the ones off of consent for discussion purposes. We have on the regular agenda, consent agenda items, we have 12 items on there. Are there any on there that we need to pull off or hold?
I didn't have any.
Have any? No? Okay. Looking at our regular agenda items. I would like to see number 2 for some discussion. Number 3 needs some action. Number 4, and if we could table number 6, so that we can talk about why it didn't go to an RFP and also some funding. Would that be all right to do that until after closed?
Yes.
Yeah.
3, I would either say move to consent for denial, or I'm happy to have it on discussion.
Okay, let's hold it for discussion. There's sufficient. Okay, with that, we did move all those items to consent. Is there any public comment on that? The ones that we have put on consent for either approve, adopt, or authorize? Okay. All right, we'll move then to regular agenda item number 2, which was held. I don't know who's gonna, is there somebody that's gonna speak to that? Come on up here if you would. The only question I have on this is, there was a comment in the comment section as I was reading down through it. And have the rates been changed for our COLAs, our market study, and our health insurance to adjust appropriately for?
So my understanding, and maybe Daleen can explain better, but we don't adjust rates until the following year. So that'll be something we will look back at the costs, and those rates will be adjusted on a following year.
Okay,
On all of our contracts, we look and in April, we have to notify those cities by April of any changes. And that's per the contracts.
And we also have a look-back period.
So we are taking the time now to finish up 18,
Okay.
which then will be thrown into our spreadsheet also with 2019 benefits and wages. And at that time, we decide if there needs to be an increase. So, and that usually happens July of every year.
So the increase that happened in 2018 will be reconciled in July of 2019.
Correct. All that will be calculated in, as well as the COLA, and then the market study as well.
And the
All of
health
that will be
health
taken into
insurance.
effect, yeah.
Okay, that was the only question I had.
All right.
Okay.
All right, a motion be in order.
I'll move that we authorize the regular agenda item number 2 as stated.
I second that motion.
I got a motion and a second to authorize the increase in the patrol contract as stated in number 2 on our regular agenda. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That passes 3-0. Okay, number 3. For some discussion. This one is to adopt or deny an ordinance that amends section 6-3-D-14. I'll walk down through the process that you went through and
Sure,
maybe
Bryce.
where it came from and why it's coming up.
Bryce Armstrong, Community Development Staff. So if you recall, this was an application that was referred by the County Commission in November to the Planning Commission for consideration of an exception to our common area requirements for certain subdivisions. This was a revisit, if you will, of an application that was made about 5 years ago. That was applicant-driven. That was withdrawn at the time, and was contacted by a county commissioner to revisit that. So we went through the process of referring that back to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission recommended approval. Basically, it's an exception that provides a applicant from not having to provide common area in certain when certain criteria are met. Namely a subdivision that is adjacent to a public park, which we do define, or a national forest land, and that subdivision has to exceed, or the open space, the adjacent park or Forest Service land must exceed the size of the subdivision, and then an access, dedicated access must be provided. Any existing accesses to that public space also must be maintained. And so that was the form that was presented to the Planning Commission, and that was recommended for approval to you. So, Commissioner Ainge had I called with some questions on it, and so may have some concerns.
And now, my understanding is that the definition of a public park there, it could include the city park, right?
Correct.
This could be county land, but it's a city park.
Correct. Yeah. Let me just read it for you. I've got the definition. So this is in the Utah County Land Use Ordinance. Under our definitions, a public park is a landscape park which is owned or leased by a federal or state agency, a city or town government, or county government, and which is operated under the aegis of such agency or government for public use.
So that was one of my concerns, is that if it's adjacent to a city park, I think the city should be kind of involved in this. And another one of my concerns was the drafting said shall, and I think that some discretion for an exception like this should be left in the hands of the county. So I think that perhaps using the language may would be a better use there.
So on the exception where it says the common area requirements shall be waived,
Yeah, I think that's a bit strong.
And the challenge with that, and we've kind of discussed that, is subdivisions are a conditional use, and by nature are an administrative function of the approving body, which in this case would be the county commission. And so an applicant who submits a conditional use by state law is entitled to approval if they meet the established requirements of the ordinance. And so, as an administrative function, it's a little, that's why we use shall, it's a little harder to build in. You want to have standards. You know, a developer, an applicant comes in, they want to know what the standards are up front. And so that's kind of the intent of using shall there.
What if it's BLM land?
I guess it has, the way we've got it qualified, it'd have to be designated as national forest, the way the ordinance is written, so.
So BLM land's not public land?
That's
Or,
public
I mean,
land.
it's
but-
not open space?
I mean, it is, we can add that, I
I'm
think.
just wondering, I'm wondering
The
why on
language was
that.
included just to
Yeah.
to limit it to national forest. We're trying to keep it somewhat narrow. You always, I mean, this wasn't staff driven, and so, you know, we tried to present something that we felt was, that met the intent of what we were trying to accomplish here, and still kind of keep it somewhat narrow when you're providing exceptions.
So what if we have little parcels, I'm just throwing out what ifs, cause what if we have little parcels that are in the middle of towns, that's county land? And they go through this process, and, how is that gonna affect, let's say a city's, annexation policy? They have them in their declaration, they're in there, but they're not in the city. But they're just this little island in the middle of, and so, how's that gonna affect the city?
As it relates to this common space
Yeah.
exception, I guess the first thing I want to say is that it's limited to certain scope of subdivision, which we rarely see. It's got to have at least 10 lots, with at least one of those lots less than 1 acre, which could meet that scenario that you've described. Similar to any other subdivision, if it's in the county's jurisdiction, it's subject to the county's regulations for land use. And so if they meet our requirements, they would be entitled to approval. If it's in a city's annexation policy declaration, we have sent courtesy notices to that jurisdiction to let them know that this is an application that's before us, and to invite their input.
Yeah.
See, I have concerns that it's so narrowly drafted. Well, let me pose that as a question. How many projects within the county do you think could potentially fall under these criteria? A very select few? I mean,
Yes.
less than 1 or 2 or 3?
Yeah, we've had the common area requirement in the ordinance for about 5 or 6 years. And this is not talking about the exception, this is just strictly common area. We've only had one that's met the criteria that they have to provide this common area. That subdivision also would have met potentially this criteria.
Got it.
But yeah, it's quite narrow. We
Sure.
rarely see an application that, number one, qualifies for common area, but, or would qualify for this exception.
So what's the intent of common area? I mean, what's the purpose?
That's a good point. Originally, we kind of had open space. Open space is kind of more aimed at preservation of areas that are sensitive, or you want to preserve, I guess. And common area is more for general use, common use of more of an amenity for the users of the subdivision. And so, and that's kind of a general distinction, but common area is more is looked at as an amenity.
So what we're after here is as we build and develop these particular types of subdivisions, we're looking for areas where the residents can go to recreate, a park, have a swing set, or in this case, we're making an exception, saying rather than within the confined acreage of this subdivision, having this plot of land where the residents can go and have this shared space, you can simply count a park or a federal forest as that shared space.
Right.
That's what we're accomplishing here, is we're saying, look, if you don't want to take X amount of your development and have it common space, if you're adjacent to a park or to forest, that's going to meet the requirement.
Correct. Try and utilize that use that's already existing.
So
that's
in
adjacent.
actuality, this expands the capacity for an individual to use the property that they own in a manner that they deem appropriate. for the development because it allows them to use current publicly owned land to meet the common area requirements that we have.
Correct.
So I can see the beauty behind that. What's the definition of the abutment in the sense of how close? They have to physically touch the next property?
Yeah.
'Cause I saw some easements in there they have to maintain, they're gonna have to maintain access, you know, to this property. So if they touch federal land, be it Forest Service, BLM, or whatever the case may be, or a park, is that just a touch point that is allowing for this, or is it?
Yes, yeah, sharing a
It's
common
not,
boundary.
it's not a block away.
No, sharing a common boundary.
And if I, for dialogue here, if I was to actually suggest changes to this, I would actually like to see it incorporated to the definition to be broadened to incorporate state or BLM, so any type of publicly owned land. So for it, a BLM, if we're at, state park, something like that, that we're adjacent to in this particular area, I don't even know if we're gonna have very many of those. The place I would see this most commonly occurring would be in the northwestern part of the county. If we have a subdivision proposed development off of an Eagle Mountain area that's adjacent to a bunch of BLM open space, I could see that as an area that wouldn't qualify as Forest Service, but the intent is to have that access to public open space. So in that case, a BLM property would most likely be the scenario that worked. So if I was to try and open this up to help it meet its intent any better, I would actually just propose that we amend in BLM lands or state-owned lands, so that we capture what we're after here is that in the subdivision, you don't have to have common area if you are adjacent to publicly owned and accessible land. That's the intent of it. I like the intent of it because I think it allows the developer, the landowner, to use their property in a manner that's more consistent with their wishes, utilizing currently publicly owned lands.
I think the only, I think currently a state park is contemplated, but the BLM just wouldn't, and so we'd have to
Right.
adjust that.
That's an easy amendment. You throw in BLM land just like you got Forest Service.
Bryce, did you guys look at, to me, it would have seemed a more natural limitation to this would have been, rather than saying at least a number of lots, would be no more than, right? I mean, if there's a couple of, if it's a smaller development, I think we're less concerned about the common area requirement. But that's, there's a minimum here and there's no maximum, right? So theoretically, this could be 1,000 units. And so, to me, it'd also make more sense that you would have a maximum
For,
here
as it
in
relates to
order
the
to
exception.
yes, in order
Gotcha,
to
yeah.
qualify for this exception. Look, I think that speaks again to, I think this is a specific, pretty narrowly drafted for, I think there's a theoretical conversation about what's the right ordinance, and then if it's so narrow that this is really specific to a development or one or two proposed developments, I think it might be best for the applicant to come forward.
Why a maximum? I'm not following that.
So the maximum, in this case, I think that the concern would be, would you want 1,000 units going in against the park? There's no cap, right? So they would qualify this exception if they had 10 lots or if they had 400 lots. And at some point, especially if this is a city park and the city doesn't have a voice in this process, you would want to put some limitations on this.
Oh, I see.
But when we're looking at the percentage threshold, the adjacent public land would have to meet a percentage of that, right?
It would have to exceed just the
Right.
size.
Exceed in size.
Yes.
So when we're dealing with impact on the actual public use, as Commissioner Ainge is concerned about, as the number of housing units increases, the available public space would also have to increase. So we would actually be, through that ratio, keeping it the correct impact.
If it was a park.
Depending on the density.
Yeah,
right?
potentially. I mean, we're capturing
Depending
it
on
just
the
strictly by
density.
acreage. We're not capturing it by number of units.
Right.
So I think that's what he's kind of referencing. But, I mean, that kind of goes hand in hand at times, so.
And I mean, when we look at our land use policy as far as density goes, we just simply don't allow that. The reason I wouldn't be super concerned about that personally is we just don't allow that kind of density.
Yeah, it's
to
very rare.
to where we're actually gonna run into 1,000-unit development.
Right, our general land use policies have a priority that encourage that to happen in the city
In the
first. We
city
have
first.
2 zoning designations that potentially could allow that type of density, but they have to have a water system, which we don't have in the county. So it's rare, but it could exist.
It's in a recreational area.
I think it's more common to, you're right. I think it's more common to see maybe 50 to 80 lots, which we've seen, which was the one that I referred to. So that potential does exist, but I mean, I get the point that we're talking about an intensity of use of an existing common, public space, and you don't want to overload that.
Right. And that's why I'm saying if we're looking at the acreage here and the units and it's tied to it, if that common space is tied into that, then the common space acreage has to increase as the density increases so that we're not overusing.
Yeah, that would be contemplated there, so,
And that's contemplated there.
right.
So if I'm just gonna throw this out too, because there's a lot going back and forth with it. I don't see anything in here in the way of coordination or cooperation with the city if it happens to be a city park, maybe as it folds into their master plan as well. Is there any provisions for that or any thought? into that
No, we
direction?
have not presented that in the proposal, but we could certainly put that in. One of our more recent,
And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times when these things happen, you know, if it's a bigger development, we are in hopes that it eventually gets annexed
Sure.
into the city. That's kind of the goal, is we make it so it's palatable enough to go into a city. And I'm just wondering if we shouldn't have some sort of coordination or cooperation with the city if we're right on their border or right next to one of their parks, or I don't know what situation that would look like, but I'm just
Yeah.
wondering.
I'll let Rob
Well, I
comment, but I do, what's that? Mr. Moore was mentioning the easement process may include that involvement. I don't think that would capture it every time, because the easement being provided would be provided by the developer up to that boundary. And so,
Yeah, you know, I totally get the idea that if we have a park right there, and here we are now creating another park right next door, I wonder if that's best use. In some cases, some will say, yeah, that's best use. Let's have parks everywhere, right next door, and open space all over. And I get that thought and that theory. I'm wondering if we couldn't continue this for a week to kind of work out some of the details of some of the thought processes with it, just so that we can understand. I think there's some simple fixes with BLM stuff that we could throw in there, so it's more palatable across the county. We'd probably have to leave Sitla off, because Sitla is actually not public land, although we kind of use it as public land, but it's technically not public land. But if there's state parks, like Commissioner Ivy mentioned, you know, that are adjacent to it, or Forest Service, I think we should probably work through that a little bit to make sure that it feels inclusive across the entire county.
so I'm hearing address potential other specifically federal and state lands. Potentially look at including a city, a jurisdiction whose facility would be utilized. I know we talked about a cap on the density. I could look at that if that's something that we would want to further pursue.
If that gets limited on already, you know, the percentages that are in there, we should look at it.
Okay, we'll look at the scenarios and kind of present that. I capture that. I capture the concerns we want. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Right, 2 weeks.
Make a motion to continue this item for another 2 weeks?
Second?
I got a motion and a second to continue item number 3 that's on our regular agenda for 2 weeks. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That passes 3-0. Number 4, there was one item on number 4 that was continued, and I asked for it to be continued. It was the Jerry Rose one. I went through and looked at all the records. And I agree with the recommendation to deny that, based on the information that I've seen with payments that have been made over the years, even to the address that was historic, or that was they're claiming was incorrect. And so I'm fine with that one. being left as the recommendation of denying. I just want to bring up the Utah County one for conversation. Paul, if you can kind of walk us.
Sure, the
That
Utah
one.
County parcel was a parcel that the county purchased in 2014, and it's out there just north of the jail. And at that time, at closing, the Greenbelt property wasn't accounted for. And so the Greenbelt rollback is still outstanding on that parcel. My recommendation to the board is to abate that Greenbelt, and then the subsequent taxes would go away because Utah County is tax exempt. The county purchased a few parcels along that same area, and I think the rollback was attached to some of them. I think some of them, the Greenbelt was taken into account. I know the board's talked to Richard Nelson, and I think we're all trying to clean up that process of making sure that Greenbelt rollback is covered on all of our purchases.
Yeah, this one's before, which it's just bothersome that we're not following our own process that we're trying to go through when it comes to Greenbelt. And I understand that. There was a comment in there, and I'm trying to get to the comment. It was on the top of one of them. Let's see, this is clear at the bottom, isn't it? There was a recommendation that in 2014, from January to October 22nd, 2014, needs to be paid, including the penalties and interest. The rest can be abated, and this has been coming up since 2014. Make payment and then abatement. This should have been taken care of in the closing. That was a comment that was left as.
Yeah, that's from that is the comment from the recorder's office, and I think that's the issue before you is there were these taxes that were not covered at closing in 2014. The comment contemplates the recommendation from the recorder's office is for the county to make that tax payment for the taxes that were owed in 2014, and then the rest would be abated because it'd be tax exempt.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be an abatement of everything.
Right.
According to this recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, the county's owned it since August of 2014. The taxes since August of 2014 until today certainly shouldn't be owed because the county's a tax exempt entity.
Right. Okay. Well, I keep saying the same thing on these things, and that is I don't want to see these anymore. I think we all feel the same way with it, but I understand that this was before we kind of said no more. So I understand that, although I don't like that we're not following it just looks hypocritical when we're enforcing it on
Well, the decision
residents out
certainly
there.
the board's.
Right. I get it.
Make a motion to approve the property tax actions contained in the recommendation letter?
Second?
We got a motion and a second to approve the property tax actions as stated in number 4. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That passes 3-0. Okay, number 6 was tabled, and it looks like we can strike number 7, but we need 8, 9, and 10.
I'll go ahead and handle those today. I'll move that we strike regular agenda item number 7.
Second that motion?
I've got a motion and a second to strike number 7 from the regular agenda. All in favor say aye.
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 Move that we approve and set a date, time, and location for a closed meeting for a strategy session to discuss the sale of real property, water rights, or water shares previously publicly noticed for sale for today's date at this location following completion of the regular agenda.
Second that?
I've got a motion and a second to approve and set the date, time, and location as stated in number 8 on a regular agenda. All in favor say aye.
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 Move that we approve. Did you announce that?
Oh, that was 3-0.
I'll move that we approve and set a date, time, and location for a closed meeting to discuss the character, professional competence, or physical or mental health of an individual or individuals for today's date at this location, following the completion of the regular agenda.
I second that motion.
I got a motion and a second to approve and set a date, time, location as stated number 9 on our regular agenda. All in favor say aye.
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 Aye, that passes 3-0.
I'll move that we approve and set a date, time, and location for a closed meeting for a strategy session to discuss pending or reasonably imminent litigation for today's date at this location following the completion of the regular agenda.
And I second that.
And a motion and a second to approve and set a date, time, location as stated number 10 on our regular agenda. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, that passes 3-0. We do have 2 work session items. And the first one is with Peggy to talk about proposed ordinance amendments to the Utah County Code Chapter 11 licensing of business regulations. I know you probably visited with all of us, I'm assuming.
Yes, I did. I visited with all of you, and if you recall, we had some changes a while back to conform to the changes of the state legislature bill that was passed, and to do with, excuse me, exemptions for business licensing. And during that meeting, we had discussed maybe taking a look at other agricultural uses and a couple of other items in here, and for me to review that and bring that back to you. There are a couple of other housekeeping items that I actually added to this also to modify the ordinance. Basically, I'm not sure if you want me to go through these line by line, but it was just adding a few additional agricultural uses, which pretty much we're currently exempting from licensing, but felt like maybe they needed to be listed in here, such as maybe the greenhouses when it's agricultural use, those types of things. Apiaries, although bees are considered livestock. Sometimes that gets to be a little confusing, but so we just thought we would add that in there. We did on number 6, it's for garage and yard sales. We did take out the time limit per year on that. That was a discussion we had in that previous meeting that my understanding was the board felt like that you guys wanted that removed. And we've not had a problem with that in the county, actually since that was changed many, many years ago. Number 10 was just adding any type of government agency. They would not require to get a license for me. That'd be difficult to make them do anyway, but.
Yeah.
And then on number 14, that was one where we added all of the rest of the agricultural uses, and some of these we are currently requiring to be licensed. Some of those are required to be licensed also through the land use ordinance. If we were to make those changes today, well, we wouldn't make them today, but if that would be your recommendation to make those changes, then I would have to take that back also to the Planning Commission, and so and have those changes done. But I would put that on an agenda
Now, say
request
that
for you to
again.
refer back.
Going back to the
So
planning commission, because I thought
some-
we had the ability as a recommendation to change or amend any recommendation from the planning commission.
Yes, you could. I just that some of these uses, for example, the repair of agricultural equipment and agricultural vehicles. Right now in the land use ordinance, it requires a business license to be issued once they meet all of those requirements. So if, looking at this today, if this is something you want exempted from needing a business license, then when I prepare the ordinance for you in the future to pass this, I would also need to take that back to the Planning Commission to get a recommendation from them
Oh,
to
from the
also
other
have
side.
that cleaned up, and then it would come back to you again, so.
Okay.
So we did add in those uses which we talked about. We also did add in commercial dog kennels. My feeling after speaking with the commissioners individually was that you wanted those exempted. That is something, commercial dog kennels can be agricultural, but sometimes they're more business related. That is something for this board to decide. The last thing that I did change, after speaking with, make sure if the sheriff is here. He's not, okay.
Yeah, he's right there.
Oh, is he? Oh, sorry. Normally, when we do business licenses, we have the health department, the sheriff's office review them. I'll send them an email with a copy of the application. They'll usually send me an email back if it's okay or not. I did speak with Sheriff Smith, and if I misspeak at all, please stand up and let me know. But we did have a conversation out in the hall, and he said that he looks at everything I send him, but that he said he would let me know if there was a concern with that. So with business licenses, I have a 10-day period before I have to have them issued. So that's why I changed this part, that not receiving an email or written communication back, but that it would be left up to the individual agencies how they wanted to communicate that back to me, whether or not they were good with the license or not. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, unless you want me to go into anything more detail.
No,
I just appreciate your work on this, and I think it's a great step.
I do too. I know we've gone around and around with it, and I appreciate you coming over and sitting down and working through it. And we hopefully we capture it. I'm sure there'll probably be something that will pop up that we go, oh, whoops, or the other direction. But it was refreshing having you come and work down through this.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So,
Absolutely.
you said that some of these are currently exempted, not by statute, but you're saying just as they apply, or maybe they seek on a one-off basis an exemption, and
Right. Some things like, we do have an apiary that we have not licensed. We considered that agricultural. But then in reading these exemptions, it felt like, oh, we're kind of making it fit in this one area, but maybe we should, list it specifically. So that's why we did.
And then just a question of, it seems like the exemptions, the specific exemptions at the top of the document are agricultural in nature and kind of on someone's own property, kind of on a limited basis. And as you get down toward the bottom of the document, some of the changes are a little bit more, you could see kind of more of the general public be invited to these places of business.
Correct.
And I'm just curious, can you make a distinction there for me on the items in 14, for example, as compared to other, businesses that are required to be licensed in the county?
Licensing is regulatory, and so we're trying to make sure for public health, safety, and welfare. So the visiting clientele, when they're coming to a place that is safe. Also for surrounding residents or businesses, that individuals are operating the business according to those regulations. We try and find that happy balance so people can pursue their pursuit of happiness so that they can have a business. Not having some of these have a license would remove my ability or staff's ability, who's ever in this position, to go out yearly and do a yearly inspection. Now that would be on a planning level. Well, let me take a step back. The fire marshal, if there's visiting clientele, he will be going out yearly anyway and doing a fire safety inspection. So there would be an inspection for that. So health, safety, welfare probably would be captured in that. If the business owner is doing something that's outside the parameters of the land use ordinance, most of the time we have neighbors calling, complaining, and then that would trigger also an inspection by our office. So they just would not be getting that yearly inspection.
So that's helpful, and I'm all for us not getting in the way and not regulating, businesses that are just trying to get going off the ground or provide their service to the community. So I guess my question is a little bit more of, what would be our logic for distinguishing, for example, the repair of agricultural equipment and agricultural vehicles, if we aren't exempting other repair shops or other, that's what I'm trying to say. What's the logic
Right,
for excluding this specific group?
This specific one, in the land use ordinance, when we added that, this type of use can only repair agricultural use equipment. So vehicles and equipment. So you could not just bring, you know, your car in to have something done. So it is strictly regulated to agricultural equipment, vehicles, that type of use. And so that's why it falls more within an agricultural use. And then although you do have the other side, as this is still a repair facility, so you're still going to have the nuisances that come along with that, as far as you know, vehicles kind of out in the open, there for a long period of time, that type of thing.
But I may have missed, you know, I'm not up to speed on the state change that it allowed for more of a umbrella agricultural change. Commissioner Ivey, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I actually could probably help answer your question a little bit. As we look through the list on 14, one of the things that I think is very distinctive here is none of those particular items require professional licensing, right, or certification to perform those operations. So when my neighbor fixes tractors, he doesn't have to go through a professional licensing. He doesn't have to meet certain professional criteria in training or education or something to do that. To have a reproduction facility for swine or equine or anything like that, there is no professional or educational requirements met in there. And so that's part of the logic there, is being consistent throughout that, saying, you know, why should we regulate beyond what a educational or professional licensing regulation should be for you to operate and perform these functions within the community?
Thanks for the background, Peggy.
Okay. Thank you. It looks like on the work session, item number 2, the individuals aren't here, so we'll just move into our next public comment, if there's any public comment.
Good morning. I'm Mark Allen, founder of Protect and Preserve American Fork Canyon, but today representing American Fork Canyon Alliance, a Utah nonprofit that I'm the director of. We are a property owner in Upper American Fork Canyon. We have a half-acre surrounded by Forest Service and county property and privately owned snowbird property. It's nice and refreshing to have 3 men here that I have regard for. Breath of fresh air. Over the past 3 years, I've stood before Commissioner Ivey and Commissioner Bill Lee with a request that Tanner I can bring you up to speed on, but that is simply I want to pay my taxes on my parcel of property. And I have noted how at times Utah County Commission have had to get out a big hammer, even with the state of Utah, to effectuate change. And I am asking the county commissioners to allow me to work with your county attorney to sue the state tax commission so I can get a tax ID and pay my taxes. I would hit the Washington Times, the New York Times, the whatever, but it's absolutely crazy that I can't get Senator Valentine to give me a tax ID for patented mine claims that have not been actively mined for 50 years. This one change should also affect Little Cottonwood Canyon, Big Cottonwood Canyon, and All American Fork Canyon, probably 20,000 acres, privately held, that does not show up on maps, some of which is encumbered by heavy metals that affect our watershed. Through this process, I've met with all the hazmat people at DWQ and DEQ, and there's another change that need to have the commissioners take a look at. There is no standard for sediment that comes down the canyon that is bonded to heavy metals that pollutes our valley floor. They only have they only look at dissolved heavy metals in water. And so for the last 50 years, every time we have spring runoff come down American Fork Canyon, goes into the irrigation system, there's heavy metals bonded to the sediment, it ends up in people's gardens and yards. So I've got those 2 things this year on my hope to get adjusted. As I hear the talk about apiaries and dog kennels and all that kind of stuff, the other issue, up in American Fork Canyon, in the top of our watershed, I can have pigs up there according to the land use ordinance, or I can have a dog kennel, but I can't allow people to camp on my property overnight in a yurt and pack in and pack out human waste, which I find very incongruent with what we've been wanting to do to protect our watershed. So I would like to task someone on the commission to help me get some of those 2019 quality laws effectuated. I don't know why the pushback from the State Tax Commission. Their statutes talk about their jurisdiction is over active mines that may span county boundaries. That's why they were set up to try and help figure out those valuations. But they send valuations down to you guys, you rubber stamping them, send them out to the people to pay, they pay you. And because of that process, when we recorded our property in Utah County, had it plotted, it doesn't end up on maps. Your databases don't talk back and forth. It's just a one-way down. So I would like to have you talk about that. I'd love to work with David Lee or Paul Jones to fix things. And as we look at north of our county up to Little Cottonwood and the central planning that they're looking for to do land swaps or maybe create a national park or whatever that they're looking to do. If we don't have this done prior to that, the taxpayer may be encumbered with some really bad mines that then we as taxpayers have to pay to clean up. We may not even be able to clean it up because once there's a national jurisdiction, we can't get in with heavy equipment and so forth to clean things up. So up there, they've got the cart before the horse. And so anyway, that's my request. I'd love to have either a work session. I'm meeting with Representative Brad Daw this next Wednesday to try and see if legislatively he can do some stuff. But I don't know anybody in the state of Utah that has begged more times to pay their taxes to get a tax ID than me. And
That's true.
That's true.
We have not found the vehicle. I know we have discussed and looked at this issue, and we want you to pay your taxes.
the question is, why does the vehicle not exist?
Well, yes, but to get to the destination, we gotta have some sort of vehicle that gets us there. And as we've looked it over and discussed it and tried to find a way, we have not found it. So it's.
Then
we've
I'd
been
like to
going
have all
round
my
and round.
taxes abated for the rest of time and still get my land put on a property, just as Paul's asking. The statute does exist, but what I lose sleep over is a statute that is so loosely worded that allows it to be misused. So the question to me is, why does the state of Utah allow that loophole? So they facilitated ski resorts. The people that were in the know have been able to buy up patented mine claims, kept it off the radar for decades. And I wonder why that is. So anyway, if we could create a work session, or if I can have 10 hours on the county attorney, we really ought to have local control here. And it makes no sense to not have local control. I shouldn't be the one leading the charge. My representatives should be leading the charge on this. But short of that, I will go pound the governor's office. I will write op-eds to the New York Times saying I can't get a damn tax license to pay my $4 in taxes. What's wrong with Utah County and the state of Utah? Anyway, thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to answer any questions if you need to be brought up to speed. There's 3 years worth of history here. But the right thing to do is to create a tax ID. When I came into the county to try and ask to get a permit to put a yurt up on my property, first roadblock, you don't have a tax ID. Second thing is, the lady who we bought the property from has been overpaying her taxes. She's been paying our share.
She's been paying taxes on that property?
She's been paying taxes on her whole piece. I can't get my half acre broken out. Even though it's got a legal description, it's been platted, it's been recorded here, I can't get a tax ID. So that's the starting point.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you for listening to me, and appreciate and happy to answer any questions if you have any at any time.
Thanks,
for
Mark.
coming.
Any other public comment? All right, seeing none, we'll move into our closed meetings. I have no idea where those guys. It was funny because they wanted to do it before the session, because when the session gets going,